Hi, I'm Tyler Dawson. I'm the Deputy Editorial Pages Editor at the Ottawa Citizen, and this is Kady OMalley. She writes about politics at the Ottawa Citizen. And we are on the Hill for the hottest day of the year to discuss the hottest news of the week, which is probably Mike Duffy and his small amount of expenses he's been claiming.
A relatively small amount of expenses, we should clarify. Between May 2nd, which is when he returned to the Senate after his legal ordeal, and June 30th, he claimed just over $1,600 in living expenses. And some of you may be remembering that living expenses were, of course, what brought him into the courtroom in the first place, lo those many years ago. But in this case, and this is my stance, I'm actually not that fussed about it. I think that there's probably, it looks legit to me.
And I mean, people could say, surely pundits are going to argue that, this, even if it's all above board, this leaves sort of a bad taste in Canadians' mouths.
Well, Canadians end up with a bad taste in their mouths, but a lot of things politicians do, and I sympathize with that, and that is why we have editorials, and that's why we have columnists, and that's why we have Twitter, and that's why we have comment threads in any number of places where people can express their views. Where I think it should kind of stop is this sort of suggestion that somehow Mike Duffy, who was, of course, acquitted on all charges, shouldn't be permitted to collect what appear to be basically mostly per diems, depending on, exactly how that money was allocated, to which he is, in fact, entitled. He is, as David Dingwall once probably really wishes he hadn't said, entitled to his entitlements.
Right. And, this summer parliamentary period, insofar as it's been going, there's lots happening. We've got electoral reform that's coming up in a bit, and also the Supreme Court's on our radar, mainly bilingualism issues and representation from Atlantic Canada. Is that right?
Yeah. One of the Justice Cromwell, who is currently the only member of the Supreme Court from Atlantic Canada, is going to retire on September 1st, and that has raised the question of, okay, how do we fill that seat? Now, the government has announced its process, which is basically, as it did with, frankly, senators, with a lot of other things, they're saying, hey, anyone who is a qualified lawyer or on the bench across Canada can apply for this slot. This is how we're going to do it from now on, which sounds great until you think about the fact that Atlantic Canada has always had at least one judge on the Supreme Court. Cromwell is that judge. If Cromwell goes, the tradition would be for him to be replaced by someone with Atlantic Canada, but when you open up the pool to applications across the country, that kind of raises the question of whether or not the government is committed to keeping that representation. So I suspect that there's going to be a lot of questions raised about that in the time to come. Now, of course, it is the Prime Minister who ultimately makes the decision. There's an advisory board that gives him a short list, so presumably he could look at that short list and pick the person from Atlantic Canada, thus saving the issue for at least the moment, but it's still, it's particularly curious considering the Liberals hold literally every seat in Atlantic Canada. So who knows why they'd want to pick that fight.
Sounds like fun. For more on this, follow along at ottawacitizen.com. This has been This Week in Politics on the Hill.